I always thought our life was perfect, Daniel began, his voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. A beautiful home, a loving wife, and a life that others envied. But perfection, as I would learn, is often just a mask for something much darker. It was a Sunday morning, the kind Daniel used to cherish. Emma, his wife of 7 years, hummed softly in the kitchen as she brewed coffee. The aroma filled the air, and sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the room in warmth. To anyone else, it would look like a snapshot of marital bliss. But something was different that morning. Emma seemed a little too cheerful, her laughter a little too forced. Daniel, a naturally observant man, didn't miss it. He smiled at her, though his mind was racing. She had been acting strange lately, more distant, guarded, as if holding on to a secret. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things. The way she kept her phone glued to her side, or how she took sudden calls and walked out of the room. As Emma placed the coffee on the table, she kissed him on the forehead. "You've been working too hard, Danny," she said with a sweet smile. "You should take it easy today." Her words were kind, but Daniel noticed her glancing at her phone, as if waiting for something, or someone. "I will," he replied with a grin, masking the unease growing in his chest. That afternoon, Emma left to run errands. She kissed him goodbye, grabbed her bag, and slipped out the door. Daniel watched her drive away, his smile fading the moment she was out of sight. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore the knot tightening in his stomach. He returned to the living room, his eyes landing on the coffee table where her purse had been. A receipt lay there, half tucked under a magazine. Picking it up, Daniel's brow furrowed. It was from a high-end restaurant across town, a place they hadn't visited in months. The date on the receipt was from the previous evening, a night Emma had claimed she was out with her best friend, Lisa. His mind raced. Why would Emma lie about something so trivial? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. "Maybe it's nothing," he muttered, but his instincts told him otherwise. That evening, Emma returned, her smile as bright as ever. "I got everything done," she announced cheerfully, placing her bag on the counter. Daniel nodded, hiding his suspicions. He wanted to confront her, but he knew better. If something was truly going on, he needed proof, not accusations. As they sat together for dinner, Emma's phone buzzed. She glanced at it quickly, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she turned it over, face down. "Work stuff," she said casually. Daniel nodded but didn't say a word. He had seen the name flash across the screen. Paul. He didn't know any Pauls in her life, at least none she had ever mentioned. Later that night, as Emma showered, Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. Her phone was still on the dining table, locked but buzzing with notifications. He didn't touch it, but the name Paul appeared again, followed by a message preview. "I can't wait to see you again." His heart sank. A cold wave of realization washed over him. This wasn't just paranoia. There was something going on, and Emma was being careful, but not careful enough. When she returned from the shower, her hair wrapped in a towel, Daniel smiled at her as though nothing was wrong. "You look relaxed," he said warmly. She smiled back, oblivious to the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. As Emma drifted off to sleep that night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The pieces didn't add up, but one thing was clear. His perfect life wasn't so perfect anymore. She thinks she's careful, he thought, a steely resolve settling over him. But even the most careful people make mistakes, and I'll find hers. Daniel's days became quieter, his actions more calculated. Emma carried on as if nothing had changed, her routine perfectly polished, but Daniel had begun to see through it all. She was careful, no doubt. Too careful. Yet he knew no one could hide everything, not forever. The opportunity came a few days later. Emma had left her laptop open while she stepped into the shower. Daniel wasn't the type to invade someone's privacy, but the little voice in his head wouldn't let it go. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest, and opened her emails. At first, there was nothing unusual. Work emails, a few receipts, and promotional spam filled her inbox. He was about to give up when he noticed a folder titled Personal. Clicking on it, his eyes fell on a thread with the subject line, "Last night was perfect." The sender? Paul. His blood ran cold as he opened the thread. The messages were brief but damning. "Paul, you looked amazing. I can't stop thinking about you." Emma, "You make me feel alive again. I can't wait to see you Friday." Daniel's hand trembled as he scrolled, his breathing shallow. It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. The tone, the secrecy, it all pointed to one thing. The sound of the water stopping snapped him out of it. He quickly closed the laptop, moving back to his seat like nothing had happened. Emma walked out moments later, her hair damp, and smiled at him. "What are you up to?" she asked casually. "Just going through some emails," he lied smoothly, masking the storm inside him. That evening, Daniel couldn't stop replaying the messages in his mind. His hands itched to confront her, to demand answers, but something stopped him. If she had lied once, she could lie again. He needed more. He needed to be sure. He decided to follow her. The next day, Emma announced she was meeting Lisa for dinner. "We're trying that new Italian place downtown," she said, her tone as light as ever. Daniel nodded, forcing a smile. "Have fun," he replied, watching her walk out the door. Once she was gone, Daniel grabbed his keys and followed at a safe distance. She drove toward the city, but she didn't head downtown. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a small, dimly lit cafe. Daniel parked a few spaces away, his heart racing as he watched her step out of the car. She looked around nervously before entering. Moments later, a man joined her, a tall, confident figure with an easy smile. Paul. Daniel clenched the steering wheel, every muscle in his body screaming at him to charge in and confront them. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for his phone, snapping pictures of them through the window. They were laughing, leaning close, their heads nearly touching. It was undeniable now. When Emma returned home that night, she acted as though nothing had happened. "Lisa says hi," she said with a grin, kicking off her shoes. Daniel simply nodded, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. "You're awfully quiet," she remarked, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Just tired," he replied, his voice calm. "Work's been exhausting." Inside, however, he was anything but calm. He was calculating, planning. If Emma thought she had been careful, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. That night, as she slept soundly beside him, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He didn't just want answers, he wanted justice. This wasn't about anger or heartbreak anymore. It was about making sure Emma and her lover regretted every single choice they had made. And he had just the plan. Daniel didn't waste any time. Over the next few days, he meticulously tracked Emma's every move. He installed a GPS tracker on her car and set up a simple app on her phone that mirrored her text messages to his device. If she thought she was being careful, she had no idea how far behind she already was. The pieces started falling into place faster than Daniel anticipated. The messages between Emma and Paul grew more frequent, more careless. Emma spoke about sneaking out and being more discreet. Paul joked about Daniel, calling him clueless and too boring to notice. Daniel clenched his jaw each time he read those words, but he didn't let them cloud his judgment. Friday night arrived, the day Emma had mentioned meeting Paul. She told Daniel she was going to a late yoga class with Lisa. "I might be back late," she added casually, throwing on her coat. Daniel nodded, barely looking up from his book. "Take your time," he said. The moment the door shut, Daniel grabbed his keys and left. He already knew where she was going. Emma's car led him to a boutique hotel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a flashy place, but it was discreet, the perfect spot for an affair. Daniel parked a safe distance away and waited, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. After about 15 minutes, he saw Paul's car pull into the lot. Paul stepped out, his cocky swagger infuriating Daniel even from a distance. Emma emerged from the hotel lobby to greet him. They hugged, lingering just a little too long before heading inside together. Daniel's heart pounded, but not with heartbreak. It was anger, controlled and purposeful. He wasn't just a betrayed husband. He was a man on a mission. He waited an hour before stepping inside. The hotel lobby was quiet, the receptionist barely glancing up as Daniel walked past. He had already figured out their room number from the app syncing Emma's messages. Room 214. Daniel stopped outside the door, his mind racing. He thought about bursting in, yelling, demanding answers. But he knew that wasn't the way. This wasn't the moment for emotions, it was the moment for control. Quietly, he slipped his phone out of his pocket and snapped a photo of the room number. Then he placed a small recording device at the base of the door. He didn't need to hear everything, just enough to confirm what he already knew. When he returned home that night, Emma wasn't back yet. She came in 2 hours later, her hair slightly messy, her smile forced but casual. "How was yoga?" Daniel asked, his tone even. "It was great," she said quickly, heading to the kitchen. "Lisa and I stayed late to chat." Daniel watched her, his face unreadable. She didn't suspect a thing. As Emma went to bed, Daniel sat in his study, playing back the recording from the hotel. Paul's voice was unmistakable, his words smug and incriminating. "She has no idea," Paul said, laughing. "Her husband? He's so clueless, it's almost sad." Daniel smiled darkly, leaning back in his chair. "You're the clueless one, Paul, and soon you'll see just how wrong you've been." Daniel spent the next few days crafting the perfect plan. This wasn't going to be a confrontation filled with shouting and emotional pleas. It was going to be calculated, decisive, and unforgettable. Emma and Paul thought they were clever, but they were about to learn how wrong they were. Daniel started with the evidence. He compiled every text, every photo, and the recording from the hotel. Each piece was a sharp nail in the coffin of their betrayal. He created a folder labeled "The Truth" on his laptop, carefully organizing everything. But this wasn't just about collecting proof. It was about using it to maximum effect. He began to set the stage. Emma had mentioned a dinner party the following weekend with some of their closest friends and family. It was supposed to be a casual gathering, something Emma had arranged weeks ago. Daniel decided it would be the perfect setting for his revelation. On the day of the party, Emma was bustling around the house, preparing food and decorating the dining area. She looked radiant, happy even, as if nothing was wrong. Daniel watched her, his expression calm, but his thoughts were anything but. As guests arrived, laughter and conversation filled the room. Emma greeted everyone warmly, playing the role of the perfect hostess. Paul wasn't there, of course. He wouldn't risk showing his face in front of Daniel. But his absence didn't matter. Daniel had all the tools he needed to make an unforgettable statement. When everyone was seated for dinner, Daniel stood up, raising his glass. "Before we start," he said with a warm smile, "I'd like to say a few words." Emma looked at him, surprised but pleased. She had no idea what was coming. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," Daniel began. "It's always a blessing to be surrounded by people you trust and care about. And speaking of trust..." His tone shifted, becoming colder, sharper. The room grew quiet. Emma's smile faltered. "Daniel, what are you..." "Please, Emma," he said, holding up a hand. "Let me finish." He turned to the group, his voice steady. "For the past few months, I've been living a lie, not because of anything I've done, but because of the person I trusted most in the world." He pulled a small remote from his pocket and clicked a button. The TV in the corner of the room lit up, displaying a series of texts and photos. Gasps filled the room as the evidence scrolled by. Intimate messages between Emma and Paul, photos of them together, the receipt from the hotel. Emma's face went pale. "Daniel, stop!" she cried, standing up. "Why?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Are you afraid they'll see the truth? Or is it because you're embarrassed you got caught?" The guests looked at Emma with shock and disgust. Some whispered to each other. Others stared in stunned silence. Emma's parents, seated near the end of the table, looked heartbroken. "I trusted you," Daniel continued, his voice rising slightly. "I gave you everything, Emma, and you repaid me with lies. You thought you were careful, but one mistake was all it took. And now everyone knows who you really are." Emma tried to speak, but no words came out. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around the room, realizing there was no way to salvage this. Daniel turned to the group, his tone calm again. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone. I did this to show that no matter how careful you think you are, the truth always comes out." He placed his wedding ring on the table, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Emma, you and Paul deserve each other, but you'll never deserve me." Without another word, he walked out, leaving Emma to face the weight of her actions alone. Daniel's calm exit left a trail of shock and whispers behind him. But this wasn't the end. He knew Emma and Paul wouldn't let things rest after their humiliation at the dinner party. The next phase of his plan was already in motion, ensuring they felt the weight of their betrayal for a long time to come. The following morning, Emma barged into the house. Her face was tear-streaked, her hair disheveled. "Daniel!" she shouted, slamming the door shut behind her. "We need to talk!" Daniel sat in the living room, sipping his coffee, looking as composed as ever. "Good morning," he said, not bothering to get up. "Don't you good morning me," Emma snapped. "What was that last night? You had no right to air our private lives in front of everyone." Daniel set his cup down and looked at her coldly. "Our private lives? Is that what you call sneaking around with Paul behind my back? You were so careful, Emma. But one mistake ruined it all." She stood there, trembling. I didn't mean for it to get this far. It was just... I don't know, Daniel. I felt like you didn't care about me anymore." Daniel laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "That's your excuse? You felt neglected, so you decided to betray me? To humiliate me? Spare me your tears, Emma. I don't care why you did it. I care that you did it." Emma sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "I made a mistake. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'll do anything to fix this." "You don't get to fix this," he replied sharply. "This isn't something you can erase with an apology." Before she could respond, Daniel reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward her. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. Emma opened it hesitantly. Her face turned pale as she saw the divorce papers inside. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You can't mean this." "Oh, I mean it," Daniel said firmly. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. You'll notice that everything we built together is staying with me. The house, the accounts, everything. I've documented your infidelity thoroughly, and trust me, the court will take my side." Emma's voice broke as she pleaded. "Daniel, please! I don't care about the house or the money. I care about you. I love you." Daniel's expression hardened. "Love? Don't you dare use that word. You don't destroy someone you love. And as far as I'm concerned, you and Paul deserve each other. But let me tell you this. Your little fairy tale with him won't last. Do you think he'll stay with you after this? After everything I've done to expose you both?" Emma froze, realizing the truth in his words. Paul was a coward, and now that their affair was public, he would run to save himself. And Daniel was right. Later that day, Paul showed his true colors. When Emma called him, desperate for support, he dismissed her entirely. "I can't do this, Emma," he said coldly over the phone. "This has gotten way out of hand. You're on your own." Emma's sobs filled the room as Daniel stood nearby, listening to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Paul's betrayal was just another nail in the coffin Emma had built for herself. As Emma sat on the floor defeated, Daniel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You thought I was clueless, Emma. You thought you were smarter than me, but let me tell you something. I'm always 3 steps ahead." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the ruins of her choices. The weeks that followed were quiet. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a sense of peace in his home. The divorce process moved swiftly, with Emma signing the papers without much resistance. She had lost the house, the comfort of their shared life, and even the illusion of love with Paul. Daniel watched from a distance as her life unraveled. She moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, far from the polished, comfortable life she once had. Mutual friends distanced themselves, and her family, humiliated by her actions, struggled to support her. But Daniel didn't revel in her downfall. He had moved past the need for revenge. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about him, reclaiming his life and finding strength in his own journey. One afternoon, as Daniel sat on his porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on everything. The betrayal had hurt, but it hadn't destroyed him. If anything, it had taught him what he was capable of, how resilient he could be. He had reconnected with old friends, started hitting the gym, and even picked up hobbies he had neglected during his marriage. Slowly but surely, he was rebuilding himself, not as the man Emma had betrayed, but as someone stronger, wiser, and more confident. One day, as he was organizing his office, Daniel came across the folder of evidence he had collected against Emma. The texts, the photos, the recordings, it was all there, a painful reminder of what had happened. For a moment, he stared at it, feeling a flicker of the anger and hurt he once carried. Then, without hesitation, he tossed the folder into the shredder. The past didn't deserve a place in his new life. Emma tried reaching out once, a short and simple message. "I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day you can forgive me." Daniel read it and then deleted it without replying. Forgiveness wasn't for her. It was for himself, and he had already found it. Months later, Daniel was out with friends when he met someone new. Her name was Rachel, and she was everything Emma wasn't: kind, genuine, and honest. Their connection wasn't instant, but it was real. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to hope, to trust, and to believe in the possibility of love again. Betrayal had once threatened to break Daniel, but instead, it became his greatest teacher. It showed him the importance of self-respect, the value of truth, and the power of letting go. Emma and Paul had thought they were clever, but in the end, they had only set him free. As Daniel stood on his porch one evening, watching the stars, he smiled to himself. The pain was gone, replaced by something far greater: peace. "They thought they could fool me," he said quietly, "but they only fooled themselves."